Stuttgart, 1955. A small cafe on a cobblestone street where the rain had just stopped and the windows still carried the memory of it in long, slow streaks that caught the afternoon light. Inside, at a corner table beneath a painting of the Black Forest that no one ever looked at, a man sat alone with a bottle of Coca-Cola in front of him. He was 37 years old, but looked older. His hair had gone gray at the temples in the way that happens not from age, but from the kind of years that weigh more than they should. His hands resting on either side of the bottle were the hands of someone who had once done precise work, but had since moved on to something rougher. The knuckles slightly enlarged, the fingertips calloused in a pattern that did not match any single trade. He lifted the bottle slowly, the way a man lifts something that is heavier than it looks, and drank from it with his eyes half closed. When he set it down again, his expression did not change. There was no pleasure in it, no satisfaction, no visible reaction at all. And yet he continued to sit there, one hand still resting against the glass as though the bottle were not a drink but a doorway, and what lay on the other side of it was something only he could see. His name was Werner Brandt. And 11 years before this quiet afternoon in this quiet cafe, in a place so far removed from cobblestones and rain, that it might as well have been a different planet, he had nearly caused a riot inside an American prisoner of war camp. Not with a weapon, not with a speech, not with any plan at all. He had done it by refusing to drink this exact liquid from a metal cup handed to him by a guard who could not understand why any living person in the state of Texas in the middle of July, in heat that made the air shimmer like water, would say no to a Coca-Cola. But this story does not begin with the drink. It begins with the silence that came before it. A silence so heavy and so complete that it held an entire group of grown men frozen in place, not because anyone had ordered them to stop, but because not one among them was willing to be the first to move. In the summer of 1944, deep in the flat sun-scorched center of Texas, there was a place that most Americans had never heard of, and that the men who lived inside it would never be able to forget. Camp Hearn. It sat on an open ground in Robertson County, roughly 110 miles north of Houston, surrounded in every direction by cotton fields and cattle ranches that stretched to the horizon without interruption. From above, it looked like any military installation of its era. Rows of wooden barracks arranged in neat lines behind perimeters of barbed wire, guard towers at the four corners, a flagpole near the main gate where the stars and stripes moved in whatever wind the Texas summer chose to send. But what made Camp Hearn different from every other base you might picture was not the buildings or the wire or the towers. It was who lived behind them, not American soldiers, not recruits in training, not officers awaiting deployment. The men who slept in those barracks and walked those dusty paths between meals and work details were German prisoners of war. Thousands of them. By the middle of 1944, the United States held approximately 400,000 German prisoners on its own soil, spread across more than 500 camps in nearly every state. Most Americans had no idea. The camps were placed deliberately in remote areas, far from major cities, far from the coasts, far from anywhere the public might notice, and begin asking questions that no one in Washington was eager to answer. Texas, with its vast empty spaces and its climate that resembled the North African desert where most of these men had been captured, held more of these camps than almost any other state. And Camp Hearn was among the largest, housing close to 5,000 men at its peak. These were not random soldiers pulled from the battlefields of France or Italy. Nearly every prisoner at Camp Hearn came from the same legendary unit, the Afrika Korps. Erwin Rommel's Desert Army, the force that had fought across the burning sands of North Africa in some of the most brutal conditions of the entire war, before being surrounded and captured in Tunisia in May of 1943. More than 275,000 Axis soldiers had surrendered in that final collapse, and the Americans had shipped tens of thousands of them across the Atlantic to camps exactly like this one. These men had survived things that most soldiers in Europe could not imagine. Sandstorms that stripped the paint from vehicles, temperatures that could swing 50 degrees between noon and midnight, Water rationed so strictly that a man learned to survive on less than a canteen per day. Artillery barrages in open desert where there was no cover and no place to hide except the shallow scrape you could dig with your hands before the next shell landed. They had watched friends die in ways that the desert made uniquely cruel, and they had kept fighting because that was what they had been trained to do, and because the alternative was to lie down and become part of the sand. Now they were in Texas, behind barbed wire, eating food they had not chosen, living under rules they had not written, surrounded by a language most of them could not speak in a culture most of them had been taught to despise. And each of them, in his own way and at his own pace, was trying to hold on to whatever piece of himself the war had not yet taken away. Among these men was a 26-year-old former Unteroffizier, a junior non-commissioned officer named Werner Brandt. And if you had walked through Camp Hearn on any given day in the summer of 1944 and asked the other prisoners to point out Werner Brandt, most of them would not have been able to do it. Not because they disliked him, not because he had done anything wrong, but because Werner Brandt was by every measure that mattered in a place like this, the kind of man who disappeared into the background, the way a single note disappears into a chord. Average height, average build. Brown hair kept short in the regulation style he had worn since basic training. He spoke when spoken to and was quiet when no one addressed him. He followed orders without argument, completed his duties without complaint, and had developed a habit over many years of positioning himself slightly behind other men in any group, not out of shyness, but out of something deeper, something practiced, something deliberate. Werner watched. That was what Werner did. He watched the way a clockmaker watches the inside of a mechanism, studying each moving part to understand how it connected to the others, looking for the detail that would explain the whole. He watched the guards. He watched the other prisoners. He watched the way tension built in a room before anyone said a word. And he watched the way it broke, if it broke at all. This habit had kept him alive in North Africa, where the difference between walking into an ambush and walking past one was often nothing more than noticing a shadow where no shadow should be, a patch of disturbed sand where the ground should have been smooth. It had saved him at El Alamein. It had saved him during the fighting retreat through Tunisia, and it had delivered him alive and unwounded into American hands when the end finally came. But that same habit had also made him invisible. Werner was the man nobody remembered was in the room, the face that blurred into the row of faces, the voice that never rose above the others. And he had come to accept this. More than accept it, he had come to rely on it. Because in a prisoner of war camp where every interaction carried risk and every misunderstanding could escalate in ways that were impossible to predict, invisibility was its own kind of armor. If no one noticed you, no one could single you out. If no one expected anything from you, you could never disappoint. Werner Brandt had turned the art of not being seen into a survival strategy, and it had worked so well for so long that he had forgotten there was anything wrong with it. He did not know it yet, but that armor was about to be tested, not by a guard, not by an officer, not by any of the dangers that a prisoner of war might reasonably expect to face. It was going to be tested by a glass bottle filled with a dark fizzing liquid that tasted like nothing he had ever encountered in 26 years of life. And the test would not be whether he could drink it. The test would be whether he could decide for the first time in his adult life to stop watching and start moving. Now, before we go any further, I want you to think about something. Think about the first time you tasted something completely foreign, something you had never seen, never smelled, never been told about. Maybe it was on a military base overseas. Maybe it was in a country you were visiting for the first time. Maybe it was right here at home, handed to you by someone from a different culture. Do you remember that moment of hesitation, that split second where your hands stop moving and your brain asks the question it always asks when faced with the unknown? Is this safe? If you do, tell me about it in the comments. Because what happened at Camp Hearn on that July morning in 1944 is really a story about that exact moment multiplied by 100 men amplified by war and stretched into a silence that lasted far longer than anyone expected. But before we reach that moment, before we stand with Werner in the dust and heat of a Texas morning, with a metal cup in his hands and a decision he cannot avoid, you need to understand two things. You need to understand the world these men had come from, and you need to understand the man who made sure that none of them would drink. Werner Brandt grew up in Freiburg, a university town nestled against the western edge of the Black Forest in the southwest corner of Germany. It was a beautiful place, old and unhurried, built around a medieval cathedral whose spire rose above the rooftops like a finger pointing at something the rest of the town had not yet noticed. His father Otto was a watchmaker who kept a small shop on Münsterplatz, the square surrounding the cathedral. His mother Ingrid gave piano lessons to the neighborhood children in the apartment above the shop. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable in the way that German middle-class families of that era understood comfort. There was always bread on the table, the clothes were always clean, and there was always a routine that held the days together like stitching holds fabric. Breakfast in the Brandt household was served at 7 o'clock every morning without exception. Schwarzbrot, the dense, dark rye bread that was as much a part of German identity as the language itself, sliced thick and spread with butter. A piece of Emmentaler cheese, perhaps some cold cuts if the week had been good. And always without fail a cup of coffee brewed so strong that Werner's mother called it drinking mud. This was not simply a meal, it was a ritual. It was an anchor. It was one of the thousand small daily acts that told the Brandt family who they were, where they belonged, and how the world was supposed to work. And Werner had carried this anchor with him into the army, across the Mediterranean, into the North African desert, and finally into this camp in the middle of Texas where it collided every single day with a culture that did things so differently, it sometimes felt like a hallucination. American food baffled the German prisoners. White bread so soft that it collapsed in your hand the moment you picked it up. How could that be? Bread peanut butter, a brown paste that stuck to the roof of your mouth with a tenacity that felt less like food and more like a construction material. Sweet corn served as a side dish which to German sensibilities was incomprehensible because corn was what you fed to animals, not to people, in the portions. The sheer staggering volume of food that appeared on the trays at every meal, more than many of these men had seen in weeks of active service. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war were entitled to receive the same rations as the soldiers of the detaining power, and American military rations in 1944 were the best supplied in the world. The irony was sharp and no one missed it. They were eating better as prisoners than they had eaten as free men fighting for the Reich. But among all the foreign and inexplicable foods that appeared at Camp Hearn, nothing confused the German prisoners quite as much as the dark, fizzing, vaguely medicinal-smelling liquid that the American guards consumed in quantities that bordered on devotion. They drank it at breakfast. They drank it at lunch. They drank it in the shade of the guard towers during the hottest hours of the afternoon, tilting their heads back and swallowing with an expression of satisfaction so profound that it looked almost religious. The prisoners watched them. They saw the distinctive brown bottles, the red and white labels, the hiss of carbonation when the caps came off. Some of the older prisoners recognized the name on the label. Coca-Cola had existed in Germany before the war. The company's German subsidiary had been one of the largest bottling operations in Europe. But when the war severed the supply chain and cut off the secret syrup that made Coca-Cola what it was, the German branch had done what Germans do. They improvised. Max Keith, the head of Coca-Cola Deutschland, gathered his team and told them to use their imagination. A salesman named Joe Nip blurted out the word Fanta, short for fantasy, and a new drink was born from the leftovers of the leftovers, whey from cheese production, apple fiber from cider presses, whatever could be scrounged from a wartime economy running on fumes. By 1943, 3 million cases of Fanta had been sold in Germany, and the original Coca-Cola had disappeared from German life as completely as if it had never existed. For the younger prisoners, the ones who had been teenagers when the war began and who had never known a Germany that was not rationed, blockaded, and increasingly desperate. Coca-Cola was nothing more than a name attached to an enemy. They had never tasted it, never held a bottle, never experienced the strange, sweet, burning sensation of carbonated sugar water hitting the back of the throat on a hot day. And the Third Reich's propaganda machine, which had spent years teaching them that American culture was shallow, decadent, and fundamentally unserious, had given them no reason to be curious about it. Which brings us to a specific morning in July of 1944. A Saturday, a morning when the temperature was already above 90 degrees by 7, and the air had the thick, motionless quality that Texans recognize as the prelude to a day that will test the limits of human patience. The prisoners lined up for their morning distribution the way they always did, four abreast, moving forward in a column that had the practiced efficiency of men who had done this hundreds of times. Bread, margarine, a tin of processed meat, everything normal, everything expected. Until a well-meaning American sergeant with a crate of donated Coca-Cola decided without consulting anyone and without considering for a single moment that his gesture might be received as anything other than simple kindness to share. What happened next would reveal something about fear that no textbook has ever quite managed to explain. How it spreads through a group of men without a single word being spoken. How it holds them in place with a force that has nothing to do with physical threat. And how it breaks when it finally breaks in exactly the way you would not expect. Not with a shout or a confrontation or an act of defiance, but with the smallest, quietest, most ordinary sound imaginable, the sound of one man swallowing. The man responsible for what happened that morning was Staff Sergeant James Howard, 31 years old, born and raised in a small peach farming town 12 miles south of Macon, Georgia, where the summers were long and the churches were full, and every family within a 50-mile radius knew every other family by name, by reputation, and by the quality of their pies at the county fair. Howard had joined the Army in 1943, months before his 26th birthday, with the expectation that he would fight. He had imagined himself in Europe and the Pacific, anywhere the war was real, and the stakes were measured in something heavier than inventory sheets and supply manifests. Instead, a knee injury from his junior year of high school football, a torn cartilage that had never healed properly, and that flared up with vicious regularity whenever he ran more than a quarter mile, had landed him behind the lines. Permanently. The Army needed men who could manage logistics, who could count crates of flour and check deliveries of canned meat and make sure that the Geneva Convention's requirements were met to the letter. Because the last thing the War Department wanted was an international complaint about mistreated prisoners, while American boys were sitting in German and Japanese camps, hoping that the same rules were being followed on the other side. Howard was good at this work. He was organized, thorough, and fair. But it was not the war he had signed up for, and he carried that knowledge the way a man carries a low-grade fever, not enough to stop him, but always present, always reminding him that something was not right. Howard did not hate the German prisoners. This was a fact that would have surprised his mother, who wrote him letters filled with newspaper clippings about Nazi atrocities, and who could not understand why her son's descriptions of camp life contained no anger, no outrage, no sense of righteous American fury directed at the men he was guarding. The truth was simpler than ideology and more complicated than forgiveness. After 10 months of daily contact, of passing food across a counter to the same faces day after day, of watching men eat and talk and laugh at jokes he could not understand, and argue over card games and stare at the horizon with the same hollow look that every soldier everywhere has worn since the beginning of organized warfare, Howard had undergone a shift that he did not have the vocabulary to describe. The prisoners had stopped being the enemy and had started being men. Not good men or bad men, just men. Stuck in the same heat, eating the same food, counting the same slow days. On the morning in question, Howard arrived at the distribution area, pushing a wooden cart that carried, in addition to the usual bread and margarine and tinned meat, a crate of Coca-Cola bottles. A local bottling plant in Hearn, the small town adjacent to the camp, had donated several cases to the installation the previous week. This was not unusual. In 1940s, Texas Coca-Cola was not merely a beverage. It was a civic institution, a point of regional pride, a substance so deeply woven into the social fabric of the American South that offering it to someone was roughly equivalent to offering them a handshake. It was what you gave your neighbor when he helped you fix a fence. It was what you bought a stranger at the drugstore counter when the conversation went well. It was what you drank on the porch in the evening while the cicadas sang and the sun went down in colors that other states could only envy. Howard had grown up drinking it. His father had grown up drinking it. To Howard, a Coca-Cola was as neutral and unremarkable as a glass of water, and the decision to include it in the morning distribution required exactly as much deliberation as the decision to include the bread, which is to say, none at all. The prisoners lined up in their usual formation, four abreast, moving forward at a pace set by the men at the front. Werner Brandt was positioned somewhere in the middle third of the column, far enough from the distribution table that he could not yet see what was on it, close enough that the shifting body language of the men ahead of him reached him in fragments. A stiffening of shoulders, a slowing of the pace, small signals that something ahead was not following the expected pattern. In front of Werner, roughly 10 positions closer to the table, stood the broad, immovable back of Karl-Heinz Muller, who occupied space the way a boulder occupies space, not aggressively, but with such density that the air around him seemed to rearrange itself in deference. Behind Werner, near the back of the line, Ernst Vogel walked with the slightly distracted gait of a young man whose mind was somewhere else entirely, his eyes moving across the camp with the restless curiosity of someone who had not yet learned to stop being interested in the world. The line moved forward. Bread was handed out. Margarine, fowl, the tinned meat that every prisoner accepted and none of them enjoyed. Normal, expected, routine. Then Howard reached into the wooden crate and began pulling out brown glass bottles with curved shapes and red and white labels that caught the morning sun. But here is the detail that changed everything. The detail that turned a gesture of goodwill into 2 days of silence. Camp Hearn, like most American POW camps, maintained strict regulations about glass containers. Broken glass was a weapon. A shattered Coca-Cola bottle could become a blade in seconds, and the camp's security protocols were clear on the point. Prisoners were not permitted to handle glass. So Howard did what procedure required. He took a church key from his pocket, popped the cap off each bottle, and poured the contents into the standard issue metal cups that the prisoners used for water at every meal. 1 cup per man, filled from a bottle, handed across the counter. And in that single procedural step, Coca-Cola ceased to be Coca-Cola. What the prisoners received was not the iconic American product that half the world could identify by silhouette alone. It was not the curved bottle. It was not the logo. It was not the brand that had been advertised on billboards from New York to California. It was a dark liquid of unknown origin, fizzing and hissing in a plain metal cup that looked identical to the cups they drank water from every day, giving off a sharp, sweet, faintly chemical odor that matched nothing in the considerable catalog of European food and drink that these men carried in their memories. No label, no explanation, no context. Just a cup of something strange handed over by the same guard who handed them bread as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Howard did not explain what it was. He assumed it was obvious. He assumed that Coca-Cola was Coca-Cola, that its identity was so universal and so self-evident that no explanation could possibly be necessary. And in that assumption and that failure to see his own world through someone else's eyes lay the seed of everything that followed. The first man in line to receive a cup was Friedrich Baumann, 38 years old, a baker from Cologne who had spent 20 years working with flour and yeast and heat, and whose nose was by professional necessity sharper than most people's. A good baker smells the way a good musician hears. The difference between bread that needs another minute in the oven and bread that has already crossed the line into ruin is something a baker detects not with a timer, but with his body, and Bauman's body had been calibrated over 2 decades of pre-dawn shifts to register even the smallest deviation from what was expected. He brought the cup to his nose before he brought it to his lips, not out of suspicion, out of habit. The same automatic gesture he would have performed if someone had handed him a new bag of flour or a different brand of yeast. His nostrils flared slightly, his eyes narrowed, and then his entire body went still, the way the body goes still when the brain receives information that does not match any existing category. The smell was sweet, aggressively, almost confrontationally sweet, sweeter than any beverage Bauman had ever encountered in 38 years of German life. But beneath the sweetness was something else, a sharpness, an almost medicinal bite that he could not place and could not explain. It was the phosphoric acid and the cola nut extract and the vanilla and the cinnamon and the dozen other ingredients that give Coca-Cola its signature complexity, but Bauman knew none of this. All he knew was that the smell in his cup did not correspond to anything in his memory. Not beer, not coffee, not juice, not water, not medicine, not anything. And for a man who had spent his life trusting his nose the way a pilot trusts his instruments, that absence of recognition was more unsettling than any bad smell could have been. Bauman lowered the cup without drinking. He said nothing. He did not turn around. He did not shake his head or make a face or signal in any deliberate way to the men behind him that something was wrong. But his body spoke for him, the slight tightening of his jaw, the almost imperceptible squaring of his shoulders, the way his hand held the cup a fraction of an inch farther from his body than it had held it a moment before. These signals, invisible to anyone who was not watching closely, were as clear as a shout to the man standing directly behind him, who had been watching Bauman the way every man in a line watches the man ahead of him, with the automatic half-conscious attention of someone following a pattern and relying on the person in front to confirm that the pattern is safe. That man hesitated, and the man behind him hesitated longer, and the man behind him stopped moving altogether. Within 90 seconds, the entire front section of the line had gone still. 50 cups distributed, 50 men standing in the Texas heat with dark liquid fizzing quietly in their hands, and not one of them drinking. What happened in those 90 seconds was not a decision. It was not a protest. It was not organized, discussed, or agreed upon. It was something far more powerful than any of those things. It was a cascade, a chain reaction triggered by the most basic and most ancient of human social mechanisms. Observation. Each man who chose not to drink reinforced the hesitation of the man behind him, and the man behind him reinforced the man behind him, and so on, in a self-amplifying loop that grew stronger with every link. But there was something else at work that morning, something that transformed natural caution into something harder and more durable, something with structure, something with intent. Karl-Heinz Müller received his cup fifth in line. He took it with one hand the way a man accepts something he has already judged and found unworthy, and then he did something that altered the dynamics of the entire group in a single wordless gesture. He did not look at the cup. He did not smell it. He did not raise it or lower it or examine the liquid inside. Instead, he looked at the men around him, slowly, deliberately, moving his gaze from one face to another with the patient precision of a factory foreman inspecting a production line, which is exactly what he had been before the war at the Blohm and Voss shipyard in Hamburg, where he had supervised 40 men and learned that the most effective form of authority is the mind that never needs to speak. Muller's gaze settled on each man for approximately 2 seconds before moving to the next, long enough to make contact, long enough to communicate a message that required no words, because the words would have been less effective than the silence. I see you. I am noting your choice. I will remember. In the social hierarchy of Barracks 3, where Muller's approval determined who ate in company and who ate alone, who was included in conversations and who was shut out, who received the small favors and protections that made camp life bearable, and who was left exposed, that gaze carried more authority than a direct order. Mueller had been a member of the National Socialist Party since 1937, not out of conviction, not because he believed in the racial theories or the imperial ambitions or the apocalyptic vision of a thousand-year Reich that the propaganda machine churned out with tireless enthusiasm. He had joined because the party card opened doors at the shipyard. Promotions went to members first. Contracts went to members first. The best housing assignments, the priority ration cards, the small but accumulating advantages that determined the shape of a working man's life in 1930s, Germany all flowed through a system that rewarded loyalty, or at least the appearance of it. Mueller had made a calculation. The calculation had paid off. And by the time the war began, the distinction between genuine belief and strategic performance had blurred in his own mind to the point where he could no longer tell which one he was practicing. But the camp had sharpened what the shipyard had blurred. In captivity, stripped of his rank, his authority, his daily routine, and the thousand familiar structures that had given his life shape and purpose, Mueller had reached for the only thing left that could make him feel like himself. Identity, German identity. The idea that being German meant something, that it conferred a discipline and a strength and a cultural superiority that no amount of barbed wire could diminish. For Mueller, the Coca-Cola was not a drink. It had never been a drink. From the moment the dark liquid appeared in the metal cups, it was a symbol. Accept the American drink and what comes next. Accept the American food without complaint. Accept the American music that drifted from the recreation hall radio. Accept the American way of doing things piece by piece, compromise by compromise, until the man standing behind the wire was no longer German at all, but something undefined, something that Mueller could not name, but that terrified him more than any artillery barrage ever had. Because the desert could kill your body, but this slow, comfortable, well-fed erosion of who you were could kill something deeper. So Mueller watched, and the men who lived under his watch understood without being told that the cups in their hands were not cups. They were ballots, and the vote was already being counted. James Howard stood behind the distribution table and watched 50 men stand motionless in the rising heat, holding cups that none of them would bring to their lips, and he could not for the life of him figure out what was happening. His first thought was that they were waiting for a command. German military discipline was legendary, and he had seen them do this before, standing in formation until someone, usually Mueller, gave a nod or a word that released them from whatever internal protocol they were following. So he waited, but no command came. His second thought was that they were not thirsty, but it was already over 95 degrees. Every man in the line was visibly sweating, and the idea that 50 men in the Texas July heat might not want something cold to drink was so absurd that he abandoned it almost before it had fully formed. Then a third thought arrived, slower than the others, less comfortable. Maybe they did not know what it was. Howard picked up a metal cup, filled it from the same bottle he had just poured from, and drank it in front of them. He made a deliberate show of it, a long, slow swallow, a wipe of the mouth with the back of his hand, a small nod of satisfaction that was only slightly performed. Look, his body said, same cup, same liquid, same source. I am fine. You will be fine. Not one man moved, and then Howard felt something he had not expected and was not prepared for. Not frustration, though there was some of that, not confusion, though that was present too. What he felt standing behind that table with an empty cup and a smile that had gone stale on his face was loneliness, a profound, disorienting loneliness that came from the sudden understanding that he was 3 feet away from 50 human beings and further from them than if he had been standing on the surface of the moon. Because trust, he was learning in real time, is not a substance you can pour from one cup to another. It does not transfer. It does not demonstrate. Trust is something that must be built slowly and painfully in the space between two people who have decided against all evidence and all instinct to believe in each other's intentions. And in the architecture of this camp, where power flowed in only one direction, and where the man with the key and the man behind the wire occupied positions so different that they might as well have been different species that space did not exist. He would write about this moment in a letter to his wife Margaret that evening. The letter would take him an hour to compose because the words kept arranging themselves into shapes that did not match what he had felt. He crossed out sentences, he started paragraphs over, and finally, near the end of the page, he wrote a single line that he did not cross out, a line that would survive the war in the decades that followed. It read, "I stood 3 feet away from 50 men today, and I have never been so far from anyone in my life. 60 yards from the distribution table in front of Barracks 5, a separate line of prisoners had received the same dark liquid in the same metal cups, with the same absence of explanation, and the same silence had taken hold. But in this line, the silence did not hold, because in this line there was Rolf Seidel. Seidel was 29, an electrician from Munich, a man whose relationship with his own temper was best described as adversarial, in the sense that the temper always won. Before the war, this had cost him 2 jobs and 1 engagement. During the war, it had earned him a reputation among the men of his unit as someone you wanted beside you in a fight and far away from you the rest of the time. In captivity, it had produced 3 formal reprimands for arguing with guards, 2 fistfights with fellow prisoners over matters so trivial that neither Seidel nor his opponents could remember what had started them, and a general understanding throughout the camp that Rolf Seidel was a man who experienced every emotion at its maximum volume and possessed no internal mechanism for turning it down. When Seidel received his cup of Coca-Cola, he looked at it for approximately 4 seconds. He did not smell it. He did not raise it toward his lips. He simply looked at it with an expression that started at confusion, passed through irritation, and arrived at something harder. Then he turned the cup upside down and poured the entire contents onto the ground at the feet of the nearest American guard. The guard was a private named Tommy Wilkins, 20 years old, from a small town outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, where his father managed a hardware store and his mother taught Sunday school. And the most dangerous thing Tommy Wilkins had ever encountered before joining the Army was a copperhead snake in the woodpile behind his grandfather's barn. Wilkins had been at Camp Hearn for less than 3 weeks. He had never been overseas. He had never heard a shot fired in anger. The dark liquid hit the ground with a sound that seemed to carry further than physics should have allowed. It splashed against the dry Texas earth and against the toe of Wilkins' left boot, and in the fraction of a second that it took the liquid to travel from the cup to the ground, something inside Wilkins shifted from routine to alarm with a speed that left no room for judgment. His right hand went to the baton on his belt. His fingers closed around the handle, and he pulled it free. He did not swing it. He held it at his side, raised slightly angled forward in a posture that every prisoner within 20 yards recognized as a threat. Not the kind of threat that comes from a man who intends to use violence. The kind that comes from a man who is frightened and does not know what to do next and is holding the only object available to him that offers the illusion of control. Seidel did not step back. He stood exactly where he was, his empty cup hanging loosely from one hand, his chin slightly raised, his eyes locked onto Wilkins with the flat, unblinking stare of a man who has been pushed past the point where consequences carry weight. Around them, the geometry of the crowd began to change. Prisoners who had been standing in loose formation tightened their positions, shoulders turned inward, bodies angled toward the center of the disturbance, not aggressively, not with any conscious intent, but with the ancient automatic response that activates in any social animal when one member of the group is threatened: the instinct to close ranks, the instinct to become larger. Wilkins' breathing changed. The hand holding the baton was shaking in a way that he could not control and could not conceal. He was 20 years old and he was alone, and the procedural manuals in his head had reached the last page without finding an entry for this specific situation. That was when James Howard arrived. He had heard Wilkins shout from across the compound and covered the 60 yards at a run, his bad knee protesting with every stride. What he saw when he got there was a picture balanced on a knife's edge. A German prisoner with empty hands and a jaw set like concrete. An American private with a baton raised and fear running so visibly through his body that it looked like electricity. And a ring of men closing slowly around both of them, not because they wanted to fight, but because the geometry of fear has its own logic, and that logic was drawing them inward. Howard did three things. He did them quickly because the moment required speed, and he did them in the right order because something in his Georgia bones told him which thing mattered most. First, he stepped between Seidel and Wilkins, physically placed his body in the space that separated them, breaking the line of sight that was holding them locked together in a circuit of escalation. Second, he put one hand on Wilkins' chest and pushed him backward, gently but firmly, the way you move a young horse that has gotten itself into a corner. And he spoke directly into Wilkins' ear in a voice so low that the words were meant for one person only. "Stand down, son. Put it away. Right now, you are fine. Stand down." Third, he turned to Seidel. He reached into the crate behind him. He pulled out a Coca-Cola bottle that was still sealed, still cold from the shade of the crate. He held it out to Seidel in one hand. Then he took a second bottle for himself, opened it, and raised it. And then in German, so fractured that it sounded like a different language entirely, he said two words. Gleich, dasselbe, the same, identical. He pointed at his bottle, pointed at the one he was offering Seidel, pointed back at his own. Then he drank. Seidel looked at him, looked at the outstretched bottle, looked at the wet stain on the ground where his cup's contents had already been swallowed by the dry earth. Seidel took the bottle. He did not open it. He did not drink from it, but he took it. And his fingers closed around the glass, and the tension that had been building in his jaw and his shoulders softened by 1 degree. 1 single degree. But it was enough. The crowd's geometry loosened. Shoulders dropped by fractions of inches. The ring that had been tightening opened by a step, then another step, then dissolved. The moment passed, not resolved, deferred, the way a storm sometimes travels around a hill instead of across it, leaving the ground dry, but the air still charged with everything the rain would have carried. Later that afternoon, Howard found Wilkins sitting behind the motor pool building with a cigarette in fingers that had not stopped trembling. The boy had the hollowed-out expression of someone who has looked over an edge and is still measuring the distance to the bottom. Howard sat next to him in silence for a while. Then Wilkins spoke without being asked. "I thought he was going to come at me, Sergeant." "I know. I do not know what I almost did. I know that too." Howard told him to take the rest of the day off. Then he walked back to his quarters and sat at his small desk for a long time trying to understand how a crate of donated soda had nearly produced a catastrophe. The answer was that kindness does not travel in a straight line. It bends around the obstacles between the giver and the receiver, cultural obstacles, historical obstacles, the obstacle of power itself. And by the time it arrives, it can look like something else entirely. What Howard had intended as generosity had landed as suspicion. What he had meant as sharing had been received as a test. The gap between his intention and their interpretation was not a misunderstanding. It was the war itself, still present, still active, still shaping every interaction, even in a place where the fighting had supposedly stopped. To understand why the prisoners reacted as strongly as they did, you need to understand the information environment inside Camp Hearn and inside most German POW camps in America during the war. It was a swamp of rumor, speculation, and deliberate misinformation. The prisoners had limited access to news. Camp authorities provided a German-language newspaper, but it was curated and sanitized. Real information came through other channels. Fragments of English, overheard by work details, letters from home that had been censored but still carried hints. And above all, the tireless engine of gossip that operates in any enclosed community. In that gossip mill, certain stories circulated with the persistence of folklore. One of the most durable was the claim that Americans put chemicals in the prisoners' food. The specifics varied. Some said it was a sedative to make the prisoners docile during interrogation. Others said it was something worse, a substance that sapped willpower and made men compliant. There was no evidence for any of this. The Geneva Convention inspectors who visited the camps regularly found no such tampering. But the rumor persisted because it answered a psychological need. It explained why captivity felt so strange, why the days blurred together, why some men seemed to lose their fighting spirit. It was easier to believe in a conspiracy than to accept that the simple passage of time in a confined space was enough to change a person. And so when a new unexplained substance appeared in the distribution line, dark fizzing, smelling like no food or drink they had ever encountered, the rumors gained new fuel. Not because anyone actually believed the Coca-Cola was drugged, but because the uncertainty was enough. In the absence of information, fear fills every available space, the way water fills every crack in a stone. While the aftermath of the Seedale incident rippled through the camp, Friedrich Baumann sat in the shade of Barracks 3 with his untouched cup of Coca-Cola balanced on the ground beside his foot. He was not thinking about the standoff. He was not thinking about Mueller or the guards or the rumors. He was thinking about bread. Specifically, he was thinking about the last morning he had spent in his bakery in Cologne on Ehrenstrasse before reporting for military service. It was March of 1942. He had woken at 3:30, as he always did, and descended to the bakery floor in the dark, feeling his way to the ovens by memory. The first batch of Schwarzbrot went in at 4. By 5, the shop smelled the way it was supposed to smell. Warm, yeasty, alive. At 6:15, his wife Helga came down to arrange the display cases, moving loaves and rolls with a precision that Baumann secretly admired more than he ever told her. And at 6:30, before the first customer arrived, she handed him a cup of coffee. Real coffee. Not the ersatz substitute made from roasted chicory root that Germans had been forced to drink since the naval blockade cut off coffee imports. This was genuine coffee, dark and rich, from a small package that a regular customer, a merchant who still had pre-war connections, had given Helga as a Christmas gift months earlier. She had been saving it. And on this last morning, she brewed it strong the way Baumann liked it and handed it to him without ceremony, because Helga was not a woman given to dramatic gestures. She simply said, "Drink it while it is still hot." And he did. Sitting in the Texas heat 2 years later, Baumann could still taste that coffee, and he understood in a way that surprised him with its clarity that the cup beside his foot was just a cup. The liquid inside it was just a liquid. It was not a weapon. It was not a test. It was not a political statement. It was a drink the same way his wife's coffee had been a drink, something offered in a specific moment by a specific person for reasons that might have been complicated or might have been completely simple. But he did not pick it up, because somewhere in the barracks behind him, Mueller was awake, and Mueller's opinion weighed more in this camp than Baumann's private understanding of what a cup of liquid meant. And at 38 years old, Baumann had learned something that Werner Brandt had not yet learned, that knowing the right thing to do and doing the right thing are separated by a distance that most people never cross, because the cost of crossing it is almost always paid in the currency of belonging. That same afternoon, a prisoner named Walter Pfeiffer brought news that changed the stakes of the Coca-Cola standoff. Pfeiffer worked on the maintenance crew for the camp's administrative buildings, a position that placed him within earshot of American officers several times a day. He had been in this role for months and had developed a quiet talent for extracting meaning from fragments of overheard English. What he caught that afternoon, spoken between 2 American lieutenants sharing coffee on the steps of the administration building, painted a picture that was impossible to misinterpret. The Allies were not merely surviving the Normandy invasion launched on June 6th, more than a month earlier. They were advancing, pushing deep into France, taking towns. The Wehrmacht was falling back faster than anyone had expected. This news split the camp along a fault line that had always existed but had never been so visible. For Mueller and the hardline National Socialists, it was fuel for defiance. If Germany is under pressure, Mueller told a small group that evening, then we must show even more discipline here. Every compromise is a surrender. Every weakness they see in us, they will use. The Coca-Cola, already elevated from beverage to symbol, now became in Mueller's framework a test of faith. For the younger prisoners, men like Vogel, who had been children when the war began and who had no memory of a Germany that was not at war, the news from Normandy stirred a different calculation. If the war was ending, and even the most optimistic among them could feel it, then the question was no longer how to resist the Americans, but how to survive the transition to whatever came next. And surviving that transition might mean learning to live with American ways of doing things that made no sense from a German perspective, but clearly worked well enough for the people who had just invaded Fortress Europe and were winning. Werner Brandt heard both arguments. He sat on his bunk that evening listening to Mueller's group talk in low voices at one end of the barracks, and Vogel's quiet conversation with two friends at the other, and he felt the familiar pull of his lifelong instinct. Observe, wait, do not commit. But for the first time, that instinct felt less like wisdom and more like something he did not want to name. That night, after the barracks had gone dark and the guards had completed their final round, Mueller called a meeting. Not formally, not openly. He simply moved to the table at the back of Barracks 3, and approximately 10 men who understood the signal followed. They sat in the dim light of a kerosene lamp that someone had acquired through the camp's network of trades, and Mueller spoke in a voice calibrated to travel no further than the circle of their bodies. This drink is a test, not from the Americans. They are too simple for tests. It is a test from us of us, who we are, what we are willing to keep. Every man who picks up that bottle chooses a side. And when this war ends, however it ends, we will remember who chose and what they chose. That is all. The men around the table murmured. Someone asked about Seidel. Mueller dismissed it with a wave. Seidel is a fool who'd made a spectacle. A real German does not throw the drink on the ground. A real German does not touch it at all. There is a difference between theater and discipline, and Seidel has never understood it. On the upper bunk against the far wall of the barracks, Werner Brandt lay with his face toward the ceiling and his eyes wide open and his breathing calibrated to the slow, even rhythm of a man pretending to sleep. He could hear Mueller's words clearly. The barracks at night carried sound the way a cathedral carries sound, along surfaces and around corners, and into the ears of men who were not meant to be listening. And something was happening inside Werner that had never happened before. He was angry. Not the quick, explosive anger of Seidel, which burned hot and fast and left nothing behind but damage and regret. This was a different kind, colder, slower, heavier, the anger of recognition. The anger that arrives when a man looks at the structure he has been living inside and sees for the first time that it is not a shelter but a cage, and that the door has never been locked. He has simply never tried to open it. Because what Werner heard in Mueller's speech was not leadership. It was not patriotism. It was not the defense of German identity in a hostile environment. What he heard was control. The same control that Mueller had exercised on the shipyard floor in Hamburg, where compliance was rewarded and independence was punished, where the foreman's approval was the currency that bought safety. Mueller had transported that system from the factory to the desert to the camp, and it had worked because the men around him were tired and frightened and far from home and desperate for any structure that could make the chaos feel manageable. But the structure Mueller offered was not management. It was ownership. And the Coca-Cola had become the instrument through which that ownership was being enforced. Werner lay in the dark and felt the anger settle into his bones. And with the anger came a recognition that was worse than the anger itself. His silence was not neutrality. It had never been neutrality. It was obedience dressed in the costume of cautioned submission, wearing the mask of patience. He had not refused the Coca-Cola because he was uncertain about the drink. He had refused it because he was certain about Mueller. certain that Mueller was watching, certain that Mueller would judge, certain that the cost of drinking would be measured in the currency of belonging. His father's voice arrived in the dark unbidden, as clear as if Otto Brandt were standing beside the bunk. Werner, patience is a virtue when you are waiting for the right moment. But if you are always waiting, you are not patient. You are paralyzed. And there is no virtue in paralysis. 12 years old when his father said that, an entire war ago, and the words had never been more true than they were right now. The next morning, Howard tried a different approach. He placed a fresh crate of Coca-Cola bottles on the communal table in the recreation area, caps on labels visible. He did not distribute them. He did not pour them into cups. He simply left the bottles there and walked away. Anyone who wanted one could take one. No pressure, no observation. But of course, everyone was observing everyone else. Before the bottles appeared, Ernst Vogel found Werner sitting alone behind the latrine block, the only place in the camp where a man could be reasonably sure he was not being watched. Vogel was carrying an unfinished letter home, the paper mostly blank, the pencil idle. He sat down next to Werner without asking permission, which was itself unusual, because the unwritten rules of camp life demanded that you wait to be invited into someone's solitude. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Vogel said with the directness that only a 20-year-old possesses, "I think the drink is just soda. I have watched the Americans drink the same thing every day since I arrived, from the same bottles. If it were poison, they would be dead." Werner considered this. "If it is just soda," he said, "then why did they give it to us? They have never given us anything beyond the standard rations." Vogel shrugged. "Maybe someone donated it. Maybe they had extra. Maybe the sergeant just felt like being nice. Not everything has to be a strategy, Werner. Sometimes a drink is just a drink. You sound like you want to try it." "I am thirsty," Vogel said, "and it is 100 degrees, and I am 20 years old, and I have been in this camp for a year, and I have not tasted anything new in all that time. Yes, I want to try it. But Mueller is not your commanding officer." "No," Vogel said quietly. "He is something worse. He is the man who decides whether you eat alone or with everyone else." They sat in silence after that. Werner stared at the ground between his boots. And that single sentence of Vogel's, "Not everything has to be a strategy," lodged itself in Werner's mind the way a splinter lodges in a finger small enough to ignore, but too sharp to forget. The bottle sat on the table for nearly 5 hours. The sun moved across the sky. The shade shifted. Prisoners walked past the table on their way to other places, and each man performed the same small choreography. A glance at the bottles, a half-second of consideration, then a deliberate look away as if the act of noticing had been an accident. The bottles sweated in the heat. Droplets of condensation rolled down the glass and pooled on the wooden surface. And for 5 hours, not a single hand reached out. Ernst Vogel broke the pattern at 11:47 in the morning. He would remember the time because the camp bell rang for the noon meal shove 13 minutes later, and the timing mattered to him. He wanted to do this before the crowd gathered, not after. He wanted the decision to be his, not a performance. He walked to the table the way a man walks to a diving board. Steady steps, each one more deliberate than the last, with the knowledge that at some point forward, motion becomes its own commitment, and steaming on would require more courage than continuing. He picked up a bottle. The glass was warm from the sun. He hooked the bottle cap against the edge of the table, the way he had seen the American guards do it a dozen times, and pulled. The cap popped off with a sound that seemed unreasonably loud in the midday quiet. A thin wisp of carbonation vapor rose from the neck of the bottle, and then he drank. Not a sip, a swallow, a real committed gulp that sent the warm, fizzing liquid down his throat before he could change his mind. The sensation was unlike anything he had experienced. The sweetness was immediate and almost overwhelming. Not the gentle sweetness of apple juice or honey, but something sharper, more aggressive like sugar, with an electric current running through it. The carbonation burned his throat in a way that made him want to cough, and he fought the reflex jaw clenched, eyes watering slightly. Then came the aftertaste, a complex, slightly bitter, almost spicy finish that lingered on his tongue and refused to be categorized. It was not fruit, it was not coffee, it was not medicine. It was something entirely new. He lowered the bottle and stood still. His eyes were wide, not with fear but with the pure and filtered surprise of genuine novelty. In a life that had been defined for 2 years by monotony and deprivation, this was the first truly new thing he had encountered. And the strangeness of it was paradoxically the most interesting thing that had happened to him in months. He took a second sip, smaller this time, more considered. And as the liquid settled, he felt himself relax in a way he had not relaxed since arriving at Camp Hearn. Because the thing he had been afraid of had happened, and it was not terrible. It was just strange. And strange, he was discovering, was not the same as dangerous. Muller saw. He always saw. He had positioned himself that morning in the doorway of Barracks 3, where the angle of the building gave him a clear sight line to the recreation area, and he had been watching the bottles on the table the way a cat watches a hole in the wall. When Vogel walked to the table, Muller stood up. When Vogel opened the bottle, Muller stepped outside. When Vogel drank, Muller began walking. He reached Vogel within 2 minutes. He did not rush. Muller never rushed. Haste was a form of weakness in his personal philosophy, an admission that the situation was moving faster than you could control. He stopped less than a meter from Vogel and spoke in a voice calibrated to be heard only by the two of them. "Do you understand what you have just done?" Vogel looked at him. And for the first time in the 11 months they had shared a barracks, Vogel did not look away. Something in the act of drinking, the sheer physical simplicity of putting a bottle to his lips and swallowing, had shifted something inside him. He was not defiant, he was not brave. He was just in that moment too honest to pretend that what he had done was anything more than what it was. "I drank a soda. I was thirsty." 4 words. Spoken without emphasis, without challenge, without any of the political weight that Muller had spent 2 days draping over those bottles. "I drank a soda. I was thirsty." And in those 4 words, the entire edifice that Muller had constructed, the framework of loyalty and identity and cultural resistance built around the refusal to drink, was met with something it had no defense against: simplicity. Muller looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to the barracks. He did not reprimand Vogel. He did not threaten him. He simply left. And that departure was more significant than any words could have been, because it revealed something that both men understood and that every witness in the area silently registered. Muller had no answer for "I was thirsty." There was no ideological response to a man's physical need. The body does not negotiate with politics. Werner Brandt watched the entire exchange from the corner of Barracks 2, where he had been pretending to read a dog-eared Karl May adventure novel that had been circulating through the camp for months. He had not turned a page in 30 minutes. His eyes had been on the recreation area the entire time, tracking Vogel's approach to the table, the opening of the bottle, the drinking, and the confrontation with Muller. And he had watched Muller walk away. That walk changed something in Werner that all the arguing and thinking and lying awake at night had not managed to change, because Werner had expected consequences. He had expected Muller to escalate, to threaten, to make an example of Vogel. And instead, Muller had simply left, which meant that the power Werner had spent a year tiptoeing around was not what he had believed it to be. Werner thought about what Vogel had said behind the latrine block. Not everything has to be a strategy. Sometimes a drink is just a drink. And he realized that his entire approach to life, the watching, the waiting, the careful analysis of every situation before committing to action, was itself a strategy. It was the strategy of the man who was so afraid of making the wrong move that he never makes any move at all. And in a world where doing nothing was the easiest thing to do, nothing was exactly what that strategy produced. He also thought about his father. Not about his advice, but about a specific moment. Werner was 12. He had come home from school with a black eye given to him by a boy named Klaus, who was bigger and meaner and had been terrorizing the younger students for the entire semester. Werner had not fought back. He told his father he had chosen not to fight because fighting was pointless when you were outsized. His father listened, nodded, then said very quietly, "Werner, patience is a virtue when you are waiting for the right moment. But if you are always waiting, you are not patient. You are paralyzed." Werner closed the book, stood up, and walked toward the table. He did not walk quickly. He did not walk slowly. He walked the way his father would have walked, with the measured steadiness of a man who has looked at all the parts, understood how they fit together, and decided that the mechanism is ready to move. He reached the table. He picked up a bottle. He opened it against the table edge, the cap clattering to the ground with a tinny sound, and he drank. The taste hit him the way it had hit Vogel, sudden, strange, overwhelming in its unfamiliarity. But Werner experienced it differently because Werner was not Vogel. Where Vogel had felt surprise, Werner felt something closer to recognition, not of the flavor, which was completely new, but of the moment. This was what it felt like to stop watching and start moving. This was the other side of hesitation, and it tasted, he thought, with a flash of unexpected humor, like someone had melted a candy shop into a glass of sparkling water and added a spoonful of mystery. It was ridiculous. It was wonderful. It was absolutely nothing to be afraid of. He lowered the bottle and looked around. No one was staring at him directly, but he could feel attention shifting toward him the way you feel a change in wind direction. And he understood why his action mattered more than Vogel's, even though Vogel had gone first. It was not because Werner was braver. It was because Werner was average. Werner was the middle of the line, the man who represented the majority, the quiet, uncommitted, cautious majority that made up most of the camp's population. When Vogel drank, the hardliners could dismiss him as a naive child. When Werner drank, they could not dismiss anything because Werner was them. He was every man who had been standing still for 2 days waiting for permission that no one was qualified to give. What happened next did not happen all at once, and it did not happen in silence. Friedrich Baumann was the third man to drink. He walked to the table less than 10 minutes after Werner, and he did something that neither Vogel nor Werner had done. He picked up 2 bottles, one for himself and one for a man named Peter Weiss, a 31-year-old mechanic from Dusseldorf who had been sick with a stomach infection for 3 days and was lying in the barracks too weak to walk. Baumann opened both bottles, tucked one into the crook of his arm, and carried it back like a man bringing medicine to a patient. And that small act did something that no amount of political debate could have accomplished. It changed the category of the object. Coca-Cola was no longer a loyalty test or a cultural symbol. It was something a good man brought to a sick friend because it might make him feel better. Muller's entire framework depended on the drink being a political object. Baumann had just made it a human one. After Baumann, the pace accelerated. A former school teacher named Helmut Gartner, 33 from Augsburg, walked to the table with the self-conscious dignity of a man who has decided that dignity includes the right to be thirsty. 2 young soldiers from Bavaria went together shoulder to shoulder, providing each other cover the way they had once provided each other cover in the desert. A quiet, bookish man named Dieter Schwartz, a former librarian who rarely spoke to anyone, took a bottle and retreated to his usual corner to drink it alone, which was how he did everything. One man, a mechanic from Frankfurt, took a single sip, held it in his mouth for several seconds with the concentrated expression of a wine taster at a competition swallowed, and then said to no one in particular, "In German, it tastes like Christmas, and a pharmacy had a child." The men around him laughed, real, unguarded laughter, the first that section of the camp had heard in days. And the laughter itself did as much to break the tension as the drinking. Another prisoner, a farmer from the Rhineland, drank an entire bottle without pausing and immediately picked up a second. When someone asked him if he liked it, he said, "I have no idea, but I have not tasted anything cold in 3 weeks, and I am not stopping until I have tasted enough." A third man took one sip, made a face as though he had bitten into a lemon, set the bottle down decisively, and walked away exercising for the first time in the entire episode the option that had always been available but that no one had considered. The option to try something not like it and simply stop. That possibility, the possibility of an opinion rather than a position, had been invisible as long as the drink remained untasted. You cannot have an opinion about something you have never experienced. You can only have a fear. The most surprising reaction came from a prisoner named Georg Reiner, a 41-year-old former mathematics teacher from Hanover, who had said almost nothing for the entire 2 days. Reiner was a man of formidable intellectual capability and equally formidable shyness. He walked to the table, selected a bottle with the deliberation of a man choosing a book from a library shelf, opened it, and before drinking raised it slightly in the direction of Barracks 3, where Mueller was watching from the doorway, in a gesture that could have been interpreted as a toast, a salute, or a very polite act of defiance. Then he drank. It was in its quiet way the most eloquent statement anyone had made since the entire affair began, because it acknowledged Mueller's position while simultaneously and respectfully overriding it. By mid-afternoon, the majority of the camp had tried Coca-Cola. Not all of them liked it, but they had tried it. The seal was broken. The object had been stripped of its mystery, and without mystery, the fear that had held the group in place for 2 days evaporated like water on the Texas ground. The hardliners held out. Mueller's group, perhaps 10 or 12 men, did not approach the table. They remained in the barracks or found reasons to be elsewhere conspicuous in their absence. But their position had changed. 2 days ago, not drinking was the norm, and drinking was the exception. Now the proportions had reversed, and the men who refused the Coca-Cola were no longer the silent majority. They were the stubborn minority. And in any group, the minority can maintain its position only as long as the majority is uncertain. Once the majority acts, the minority becomes an outlier. 3 days later, on an afternoon so hot that the guards had shortened the outdoor work details by 2 hours, Karl-Heinz Mueller drank a Coca-Cola. He did it without announcement, without ceremony, and without any indication that it contradicted everything he had said and implied for the past 5 days. He simply walked to the table on his way back from the latrines, picked up a bottle open. It drank it in 4 long swallows, set the empty bottle down, and continued walking to the barracks without breaking stride. The entire sequence took less than 30 seconds. Werner Brandt saw it happen. He was sitting on a bench nearby, writing a letter to his mother that he knew would be censored down to pleasantries, and he looked up at exactly the right moment, as if some instinct had told him that the thing he had been waiting to see was finally occurring. He watched Mueller drink. He watched Mueller set the bottle down. He watched Mueller walk away without looking back, his shoulders set in the same rigid line. They always held his stride unchanged, his face giving nothing away. And Werner understood something that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Mueller had not changed his mind. He had not had a revelation. He had not been converted by the taste of American soda or the example of his fellow prisoners. He had simply reached the limit of his own endurance, the point where the body's need for cold liquid in 100-degree heat overrode the mind's commitment to a position that had already lost its audience. Mueller drank not because he wanted to, but because maintaining the refusal had become more exhausting than breaking it. And that was perhaps the most human thing Werner had ever seen him do. Because the truth that Mueller's surrender revealed was not about weakness. It was about the weight of control. For 5 days, Mueller had been carrying the burden of an entire group's resistance on his shoulders, maintaining a position through sheer force of presence, holding himself rigid while everything around him softened. And control of that kind is not free. It costs energy. It costs vigilance. It costs the small, constant expenditure of will that comes from being the last man standing in a fight that everyone else has already walked away from. Mueller's drink was not a collapse. It was the moment when the cost finally exceeded what he was willing to pay. Werner set down his pen and watched the empty bottle on the table. In the late afternoon light, it caught the sun, and through a small prism of color onto the wood, a tiny rainbow from the curves of the glass. It stayed there for perhaps 10 seconds before a cloud moved and the light changed. And Werner thought that is what just happened. A small, brief, beautiful thing that no one will record and no one will remember. But it happened, and it matters. The Coca-Cola incident opened a door that could not be closed, not because the drink itself was important, but because the act of trying it established a precedent for trying other things. And once that precedent existed, the cultural barrier between the German prisoners and their American environment began to thin in ways that surprised both sides. Bauman was the first to cross the threshold in a tangible way. Within 2 weeks, he had approached Sergeant Howard through the camp's informal communication channels and proposed an arrangement. He would bake bread for the camp kitchen using his professional skills if Howard could secure the ingredients. Howard agreed immediately. What Bauman created was something neither German nor American, a hybrid loaf that used the dark, dense technique of traditional Schwarzbrot, but incorporated cornmeal, a staple of Southern American baking that was abundantly available in Texas. He called it Texas Broad, and it became in its small way a sensation. The American guards requested it. The German prisoners ate it with something approaching nostalgia because it tasted like home, but also like somewhere else, a combination that is, if you think about it, the definition of a new beginning. Vogel began learning English. Not formally. Camp Hearn did not offer language classes, but through a series of quiet exchanges with a young American private named Robert Jennings, 22, from a farm outside Lubbock, who had an inexplicable interest in learning German because he said his grandmother had come from Bavaria and he wanted to surprise her with a few phrases at Thanksgiving. The arrangement was simple. One German word for one English word traded during the 15-minute breaks in the work details. Vogel's first English word beyond basic commands was Coca-Cola. Jennings's first German word was Durst, thirst, and those two words placed side by side contained the entire story in miniature. The language exchange grew. Within a month, Vogel could construct simple sentences in English, and Jennings could order a beer in German, which was Jennings insisted the most important sentence in any language. But the real value of the exchange was not linguistic. It was the relationship itself. Two young men from opposite sides of a war discovering that they had more in common than either of them had expected. They were both youngest sons. They both missed their mother's cooking. They both thought the Texas sun was trying to kill them personally. And they both, in their different ways, were trying to figure out what kind of men they would become once the war was over and the uniforms came off and they had to build lives out of whatever was left. Vogel told Jennings about a girl named Anna back in his village in Saxony, a girl he had been too shy to kiss before the war, and whom he now thought about every night before falling asleep, wondering if she had waited or if she had forgotten. Jennings told Vogel about a girl named Betty Lou in Lubbock, who had written him letters every week for the first 6 months and then stopped without explanation, which was, he said, worse than being shot at, because at least when someone shoots at you, you know where you stand. These conversations, halting bilingual, sometimes requiring elaborate pantomime to bridge the gaps, were happening not just between Vogel and Jennings, but in pockets throughout the camp. The Coca-Cola had not caused these connections, but it had removed a barrier that had been preventing them. Once the prisoners had accepted one unfamiliar thing from the Americans, the cost of accepting the next unfamiliar thing was lower, and the thing after that was lower still. It was the psychological equivalent of opening a door that had been painted shut. The first crack required all the force, and after that, every subsequent push was easier. Other changes followed. Prisoners who had refused to listen to the American radio in the recreation area began drifting closer to it, drawn by the big band music and the baseball commentary that they could not understand but that had a rhythm and energy requiring no translation. A group of prisoners started a soccer league and invited American guards to play. One prisoner, a former art student from Dresden, began drawing portraits of American guards in exchange for cigarettes, and the portraits were good enough that several guards mailed them home to their families. None of these changes were dramatic. None of them made headlines or appeared in reports. They were small, incremental human adjustments, the kind of changes that happen when people stop seeing each other as categories and start seeing each other as individuals. And all of them trace back to a moment when a group of men stood in line holding cups of dark liquid and had to decide one by one whether the unfamiliar was the same as the unsafe. I want to pause here and ask you something. If you served in the military, in any branch, in any conflict, did you ever experience a moment like this? A moment where something small, something that should have been trivial, became a dividing line between how things were and how things were going to be. Maybe it was a meal, maybe it was a conversation, maybe it was seeing someone on the other side of a conflict do something unexpectedly human. If you have a story like that, I would genuinely like to hear it. Put it in the comments. Because I believe that these small moments, the ones that never make it into the history books, are the ones that actually change the world. Not the treaties, not the battles, the moments when one person decides to stop being afraid and do something ordinary. Camp Hearn closed in 1945 after the war in Europe ended. The prisoners were repatriated to Germany in stages over the following months, returned to a country that many of them barely recognized, cities bombed to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, an economy in collapse, and the full horror of the Nazi regime's crimes laid bare for the world and for them to see. Adjusting to post-war Germany was for many former prisoners harder than captivity had been, because at least in the camp, the future was someone else's responsibility. Now it was theirs. Ernst Vogel returned to Saxony, but Saxony was no longer the place he had left. It was now part of the Soviet occupation zone, and within a few years it would become part of East Germany, separated from the West by a border that grew harder and more permanent with each passing year. The English Vogel had worked so hard to learn was useless behind the Iron Curtain, and the openness he had cultivated in the Texas sun became a liability in a new system that rewarded conformity as rigidly as Muller's group had. He married Anna, the girl from his village, who had not forgotten him, who had waited through 4 years of silence because she had always known he would come back. They had 3 children. Vogel worked in a machine factory. He never left East Germany. He never drank another Coca-Cola because Coca-Cola was not available on his side of the wall. But he told his children the story of the day he drank one in Texas, and it became a family legend, the tale of the day their father, at 20 years old, learned that being afraid and being in danger are not always the same thing. Friedrich Baumann returned to Cologne and found his bakery on Ehrenstrasse destroyed. The British had bombed Cologne more heavily than almost any other German city, over 260 air raids during the course of the war, reducing 90% of the city center to rubble. The shop where he had baked Schwarzbrot every morning at 4 was a pile of broken stones. He rebuilt it over the course of 3 years. When the bakery reopened in 1948, the first item on the menu was Texas Brat, the cornmeal rye hybrid he had invented at Camp Hearn. He never told his customers where the recipe came from. They simply liked it and it sold well, and for Baumann that was enough. Helga worked beside him again, arranging bread in the display case with the same precision she had always shown, and if she noticed that her husband sometimes paused while kneading dough and stared out the window with an expression she could not quite read, she did not ask about it. Some things were best left unspoken until the person who carried them was ready to speak. Karl-Heinz Müller returned to Hamburg and found the Blumenthal shipyard heavily damaged but operational. He was offered his old position back. Denazification proceedings had cleared him as they cleared the vast majority of low-level party members, and his skills were needed for the rebuilding effort. He accepted. He did not speak about his time as a prisoner in America. He did not correspond with anyone from Camp Hearn. And if anyone had asked him about the Coca-Cola incident, he would almost certainly have denied that it had any significance at all, because for Mueller, admitting that a bottle of soda had cracked his authority would have been more difficult than anything the war or the camp had required of him. Werner Brandt returned to Freiburg and found his father's watchmaking shop damaged, but standing. Otto Brandt had survived the war. Ingrid Brandt had not. She had died in a bombing raid in late 1944, 3 months after Werner drank his first Coca-Cola, an event she never knew about, and that Werner could never tell her. He inherited the shop, but did not have the skill or the temperament to continue his father's trade. He moved to Stuttgart, found work in a household goods store, and built a quiet, unremarkable life that would not have been worth telling a story about, except for one detail. He kept in touch with James Howard. This was not unusual. Hundreds of former German POWs maintained correspondence with their American guards after the war, a phenomenon documented by historians that speaks to the unexpected bonds formed in those strange liminal spaces where enemies live side by side, and discovered that the person across the wire was just another human being trying to get through the day. The letters between Werner and Howard were not profound. They discussed weatherwork families. Howard married his sweetheart from Macon in 1946 and had 3 children. Werner married a woman named Liesel in 1948 and had 2. The letters arrived every few months, written in Werner's increasingly confident but never quite natural English, and Howard's unchangingly terrible but sincere attempts at German. But one letter written in 1955, the year our story opened, was different from the others. Werner Brandt sat in the Café Am Markt in Stuttgart on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1955, 11 years and 3 months after the morning that had changed the way he understood himself. He had ordered a Coca-Cola. The cafe had started carrying it 2 years earlier, part of the wave of American products flooding into West Germany during the post-war reconstruction. He drank from it the way he always drank from it, slowly, tasting not just the liquid, but the memory it carried, which was sweeter and more complex than any flavor a chemist could design. On the table in front of him was a letter he had been working on for 3 days, writing and crossing out and rewriting because what he wanted to say was simple, but the words in English kept arranging themselves wrong. Finally, he had settled on this. Dear James, I hope this letter finds you and Margaret and the children in good health. Stuttgart has had much rain this month. The shop is doing well. Liesel sends her greetings as always. I am writing today because I have been thinking about something for a long time, and I have not been able to say it in the right way until now. It is about the Coca-Cola. You will probably laugh when you read this because to you it was never important. You were just a man doing his job, giving thirsty people something to drink on a hot day. I understand that now, but at the time for me, it was something else entirely. Before that day, I had spent my whole life watching. I watched what other people did before I decided what to do. I watched which direction the group moved before I moved. I told myself this was wisdom. I told myself this was the careful way to live. But in that camp, holding that cup, I understood for the first time that watching is not always wisdom. Sometimes it is just fear with a better name. When I finally drank, it was not because I was brave. It was because I was thirsty and tired of pretending I was not. And that is such a small thing, James. Such a small, ordinary thing. But it was the first decision I ever made that belonged only to me. Not to the group, not to the man standing next to me, not to the man I was afraid of. Just to me. Thank you for the Coca-Cola, not because it was good, it was strange and too sweet and burned my throat, but because it was the first time I had to decide something for myself. And I have tried to keep deciding ever since. Your friend Werner. He folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, wrote the address in Macon, Georgia, and walked to the post office in the rain. The Coca-Cola on the cafe table sat half-finished condensation running down the glass. The waitress cleared it an hour later without knowing that it meant anything at all. History has a way of remembering the large things and forgetting the small ones. We remember D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge and the liberation of the camps. We remember the names of generals and the dates of treaties. We build monuments to the moments that change the direction of nations. And all of that is right and all of that matters. But history is also made in the moments that no one records. In a line of men holding cups they will not drink from. In a boy of 20 taking a sip because his body was thirstier than his mind was afraid. In a man of 26 discovering that the distance between watching and doing is exactly one decision wide. And in a man of 34 standing in a doorway with his arms crossed, learning that the weight of control is heavier than the weight of surrender. The Coca-Cola incident at Camp Hearn was never documented in any official record. There is no file for it, no report, no footnote. The men who lived through it did not talk about it afterward, not because they had forgotten, but because the language for what happened did not exist in any form that felt adequate. How do you explain that a cup of soda changed the way you understood yourself? How do you tell someone that the most important moment of your war was not a battle or a wound or a capture, but a silence that lasted 2 days and ended with a sound, the hiss of a bottle cap that still echoed in your memory decades later? You do not explain it. You simply live with it. And if you are Werner Brandt, you write one letter about it to the only person who might understand, and then you move on carrying the lesson in the way that all of us carry the lessons that matter most. Quietly, privately, in the space between what we show the world and what we know to be true. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is not to charge a hill or face down a tank or stand alone against impossible odds. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is to pick up a glass of something he has never tasted before, something strange, something unfamiliar, something that everyone around him has decided to refuse and drink it. Not because he knows it is safe, not because he is trying to prove something, but because he is thirsty and he has decided after a lifetime of watching other people make decisions that this one will be his. It was never about the drink. It was about the silence before it and the courage it took to break that silence with the smallest possible sound, the sound of a man swallowing. Thank you for spending this time here. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of a moment in your own life when you had to decide between following the group and following yourself, I would be honored if you shared that in the comments below. And if you believe that these quiet, true stories from the past deserve to be told, subscribing to this channel helps make sure they are. Every voice in the comments, every subscription, every share helps keep these stories alive for the next generation, the generation that needs to hear them most. Until next time, stay thirsty and stay brave.